Today, how long could public sector strikes last? Are Brits anti-maths? And why have the Brecon beacons been renamed? This is Politics Live. With me today, former Conservative Cabinet Minister Simon Clarke, Labour MP Chris Bryant, Liberal Democrat MP Layla Moran and journalist and commentator Inaya Folarin Iman. Today, are we heading for a summer of strikes?
If that ballot is successful, it will mean further strike action right up until Christmas.
There are other unions who are currently in the process of balloting their members, and hopefully they can see that the offer that we put forward is a reasonable one.
This former Cabinet Minister wants the government to cut taxes. Should it? Are attack adverts like this gutter politics or fair game? Rishi Sunak wants youngsters to study maths up to 18. Will it work?
Labour's got a plan, Rishi Sunak doesn't, and it's Rishi Sunak that needs to go back to school.
This place has a new name now, or rather, an old one. Banai Brecon, an old name for a new way to be.
And just why have the Brecon Beacons National Park been renamed? Let's start today's programme with some maths. No tricky questions for our guests. Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, has been talking about the issue and promoting his idea that everyone should study some form of maths until the age of 18. Let's take a listen to some of his speech.
I'll be honest. When my two young daughters first heard me talk about them doing more maths, they weren't too excited. And that's just it. We make jokes about not being able to do maths. It's socially acceptable. We say things like, oh, maths, I can't do that, it's not for me, and everyone laughs. But we'd never make a joke like that about not being able to read. So we've got to change this anti-maths mindset.
Well, maybe we should start with a former maths teacher. Layla Moran, do you agree? Because up until this point in time, you have to study mathematics till you're 16, take GCSEs or something equivalent. But after that, you don't. Should that change?
Well, to the point around, we need to celebrate maths and make it something that's a bit less boring and a bit more relevant, I couldn't agree more. I mean, the number of young people who, I'd speak to, trying to encourage them to do a bit more, and they'd say, well, I don't see why it's relevant. And what I would say is, I don't think you can do this. Whilst I celebrate it and think it's great, I did a physics degree, I love maths, I appreciate others don't. So how do we make it more interesting for people? Well, you start by actually, I think, having a curriculum that starts with how are we going to hook these young people into it? And that's what they aren't tackling. If this came as part of a wider reform of the curriculum, where we also include arts, because if you look at how the brain develops in young people, actually helping the art side of the brain helps the math side. There's always been a link between the two, like physics and music, for example, very, very closely linked. We shouldn't be losing that. So arts as well as maths, and actually a whole different approach to how we do a curriculum in this country, that's what's going to fix that problem. I'm not sure a big announcement like this with very little money behind it and, a wish is going to do much cop, I'm afraid.
Do you agree with Rishi Sunak? Should all students study some form of mathematics to 18?
I understand the point that the Prime Minister is making here about the fact that the UK as a society is weak at maths by comparison to many of our global competitors. You think of countries in particular like Japan or South Korea, but you could point to many others, frankly, which have a better record than we do. And I mean, look, I am not a scientist or a mathematician myself. I'm an historian by education, but I absolutely recognise that there is a weakness here. I think it's important that we work out exactly how we're going to make this work, because obviously it's going to require
there aren't enough maths teachers now,
significant increase in the number of maths teachers. But I do think rigour in the education system is something which we absolutely need to underscore.
Are you a fan of this idea?
Well, I'm a fan of maths. I was quite good at it at O-level. There were O-levels in my day.
And mine.
But I wish governments were rather better at maths, incidentally, especially the government that you're a member of. But leaving that snide comment to one side for a moment, the real problem is that we haven't got enough maths teachers now. It's a serious point because I spoke to a head teacher, an executive head, big school in England the other day, and he was telling me that the last 3 times they'd advertised for maths teachers, they'd not had a single teacher apply. So it's all very well with saying we're going to teach lots more maths, but I noticed Gillian Keegan herself this morning, the Education Secretary, said that there aren't enough maths. Now, can we just do a little maths test? Very short maths test. This is one for you, Simon. Which would you say of the following numbers is higher and which is lower? 29,364 or 27,556?
I would say that the 30,000, which is the starting salary for new teachers that we will have in place next year, is the figure which we should be concentrating
So
on.
I think, so you don't know. All right, so we really have got a problem with maths. Basically, the government keeps on saying we've got more GPs now than we used to have. We've actually got fewer by their own statistics. And you could say exactly the same. Rishi Sunak came into the chamber and he said boldly that the number of asylum applications that were still left undone...
All right, this was not going to be an opportunity to say everything you wanted to say about the government's failings in your mind.
Got long enough.
Inaya, what about the idea, though, about... I mean, it is a serious proposition, but Chris is absolutely right. We don't have the maths teachers now, so where would we find them? But is it an aspiration worth pursuing?
Absolutely. I mean, other forms of qualifications, the International Baccalaureate, they do maths, English, maths, science and a language up until 18.
Yeah, it's great.
And it's an excellent programme that is recognised internationally. And I think the UK government wants to model some of those things. But I think the wider point about the fact that where does it come in our political priorities at the moment? We've got teachers striking, talking about staff shortages in the education sector, alongside the backlog in terms of catch-up during the pandemic. So it just seems like a nice idea, but when it comes to the priorities in the education system and how to deliver it, it doesn't seem to have many legs.
I would also point out, you know, before we talk to 18, there's about a third of kids who don't get a 5 at GCSE currently. So if you want people to go further, actually you need to start addressing some of the issues with numeracy way further down. And I'm afraid this government has said that they've been doing that for years and it's not working. So we need a complete different change of approach.
Music in particular, because music is and the arts.
Pattern recognition.
Broadened out from
Pattern
maths. I'm going to
recognition.
give it a 5 out of 10, just for the moment, in terms of that idea. From
8
this
for effort?
Maybe. We're going to talk about one of the priorities that Inaya mentioned, which is, of course, strikes. Let me just show you the front page of the Daily Express. Nurses warn strikes could last all year. Junior doctors are preparing for further strikes too, following their 4-day walkout last week. And you heard in the headlines later this month, members of the Royal College of Nursing will walk out again for 48 hours. Let's talk to the BBC's chief political correspondent, Nick Eardley. This next round of strikes by the nurses, Nick, that's going to represent something of an escalation, isn't it?
It is, Joe, because not only is it going to be 48 hours, but some of the elements of care that nurses have agreed to go back to when there's a need, like some elements of critical care, aren't going to be covered this time. And it's really interesting when you look at the situation with the RCN. Yes, some of the other unions are still voting. Yes, Unison have accepted the pay deal. But when it comes to the RCN, that situation looks pretty stuck at the moment because the government isn't going to revisit this figure. The RCN is saying that it's going to keep going.
Right, and does that imply that this big meeting, this sort of council being held, representing all the unions, will to some extent could, if the GMB and Unite Union decide to accept the offer on the table, might place the RCN in something of a bind?
Well, it might do, because if enough of the unions back it, then the pay deal will happen. It will be imposed on RCN members. And then there's the question of what the RCN does next. It's named those 2 strike dates for next month. But to keep going till the end of the year, as Pat Cullen was suggesting yesterday, it needs to get another mandate from members. And speaking to some people in government, I think there is a bit of a sense that they're not that sure that the RCN would get that mandate. They look at how close the result was in the vote on the pay deal, and they just wonder, I think, whether maybe the RCN might run out of steam over the next few weeks. The union's absolutely adamant that it's going to keep going with this and fight its corner. I think some are making the calculation now that maybe that won't happen.
Nick Eardley, thank you very much. Simon, these strikes have been going on broadly since autumn last year. Matthew Taylor, just to take one representative, CEO of NHS Confederation, say it will be impossible to make any progress on the backlog pre-pandemic or during the pandemic surely the government now needs to meet these demands, get closer to it to bring an end to these strikes.
Well, look, we've put a very generous offer on the table. So there's a 5% uplift in pay in 2023 and a bonus backlog payment of £2,000. Well, as we heard, it's been accepted by Unison members, 74% of whom voted in favour, and other unions are still voting on this. And whilst the RCN result is very disappointing, and more so because, of course, Pat Cullen, their leader, recommended accepting this deal.
Yes.
I do think that we have to wait until this big meeting on May the 2nd to see what the other unions have concluded by that time in terms of their votes.
And that will be after the next strike.
And indeed, and look, I really regret the fact these strikes are going ahead. It obviously is going to prejudice patient care. I think it is a genuinely fair offer, the more so because inflation is falling and is going to fall sharply by the end of the year. So a 5% increase in pay plus the £2,000 bonus payment is actually a material offer. And I think a lot of nurses will be uncomfortable about leaving patients in the lurch in the way that otherwise risks happening.
Do you agree that the pay offer was fair and reasonable, Chris?
Well, it's not for me to agree or disagree, really.
Well, I think it is, Chris. I think you have to take a view on this. You can't hide behind not answering.
If I might answer in my own way, I think that I wish the strike weren't happening.
Of course.
I note that although there is an ambition to get inflation down to 5% by the end of the year, at the moment it's still stubbornly high at 10.4%. The government had expected it to have fallen in this last month and it didn't.
No.
So that is really worrying. I think the government has messed up the NHS for the last 13 years because we've not invested enough.
Let's stick to the question, though. Is it a fair and reasonable offer? I mean, Simon Clarke is right. Pat Cullen herself thought it was, recommended it, and it was a sort of narrow majority that voted and rejected the deal. Do you think it's fair?
So I think the way most nurses that I've spoken to have looked at the deal is not only as a deal in itself, but in the context of their work experience. And if you go into a ward and there are meant to be 5 nurses on that night and there are only 3, day after day after day, it so completely wears you down.
Sure.
And then you hear ministers saying everything's going brilliantly in the NHS. That wears you down. When you see agency staff coming in and they're not able to do all the jobs that you're able to do as a full-time member of staff.
A bigger pay offer might have mitigated against that.
I think this is the government's mess and the government needs to sort it out.
The Labour Party need to answer what they would do then.
They need to sit round the table with all the unions and come to a solution. They got us into this mess. It's not my job to sort out your mess.
And I'm afraid if the Labour Party wants to pretend that they're a government in waiting and they need to answer substantive questions like this one, is this a dispute that should continue? Should we pay? Chris, all right, let me put this to you. Do you believe that we should pay more than 5% on a £2,000 bonus payment? And if you do, how would you fund it?
Because I'm not the negotiating team for any of the trade unions.
Won't answer.
Because we're not the government. I would like, of course, I would like every nurse to receive something that gets closer to the 10%.
Then say how you pay for it.
Well, Simon, honestly, this is your mess. You allowed this to run on for months and months and months. I would argue that I think you deliberately wanted to have these strikes.
In this course,
Simon, answer that accusation, and then I'm going to come to Layla.
And I find it very... I get fed up with Tory ministers going on and saying everything's going brilliant in the NHS, when I know that there are people up and down the country who are waiting for so long in the 7.2 million backlog
so why won't you just
that they are paid.
Pay them more.
Because we're not the government.
Fine. All right, but Simon, do you want to answer the... First of all, since you brought it up, you're talking about the party chairman, Greg Hands, who did, probably quite astonishingly to some people watching the programme, when asked about the state of public services, said, I think they're in pretty good shape. Do you think they're in pretty good shape?
I think we all recognise that there are serious challenges with our public services after the pandemic, and look, there's a huge backlog of care which we all want to see addressed, and these strikes are, of course, preventing that backlog from being addressed.
Before the pandemic.
All right, let Simon answer. Hang on, Chris. Let Simon answer. I'm coming to Layla.
It is a lie that there is a COVID backlog in our NHS, and I'm afraid it's
there were 4.8 million people in the backlog.
There was a backlog before. All right, let me come to Layla, another opposition party.
Yeah.
Do you think that 5% was a reasonable pay offer?
Well, clearly the nurses didn't.
What do you think?
What I can say is that it really depends on where you work as to what you ended up getting. 5 is there or thereabouts. But bear in mind These are the same nurses that during that pandemic, where they were already working really hard. I don't know if you were speaking to some before, but they were telling me it was already difficult. And then they went through the pandemic. Then we went out and clapped for them. And this inflation, you say inflation's coming down, but inflation is now built in. The inflation that you and Liz Truss caused is now built in. It's now built in, and it's these nurses that are paying for it. So if they are saying that this isn't enough, then I'm listening to them. I would point out to the government that we're nearly there. The fact that it was go back to the table, talk to them. Clearly the landing zone is in sight, negotiation speak. The landing zone is in sight. Go back and sort this out, because on the doors, I've been spending the last 2 weeks door knocking, as I'm sure many of us have. This is the number one issue. The NHS is the number one issue, and the economy, that is coming up on doors.
Sure. And have the Liberal Democrats put aside money
surely
in their costings for a bigger pay rise than 5%?
Honestly, the thing that we need to do right now is to stop the Tories from tanking the economy in the way that they are. The cost of Tory living crisis is what is hitting anyone's ability to predict what we're going to be able to spend at the next
and inflation
general
is still
election.
running at double digit. It may come down on Wednesday, it may come down below double digit, and that
But inflation doesn't mean prices go down. No, let me just finish this point, though, because you're about to say inflation's going down, so we don't need to pay them more. Inflation is built in month on month. They're already, this is backwards looking.
All right, well, let's have an answer, and then I'll come to
The point is, this is a 5% pay increase and a £2,000 bonus payment. If you wish to pay more, then the Liberal Democrats need to explain how they would pay for it. I mean,
I'll tell you what, we're more likely to pay for it than you guys being in charge of the finances, because you have absolutely run them into the ground, and that's why we need a change of government.
That's a facile answer to a serious question.
It's an important question.
And this debate is absolutely reductive. If the two opposition parties on here won't answer the question, do they agree that the strike should be happening? Do they think the pay offer is fair?
Hang on.
And how would they pay for more money?
I'm going to ask Inaya, because you're not an opposition politician or a politician in any sense. But what is your view? Do you think health workers should have accepted that offer? Do you think it is fair and reasonable? Or, as Simon has said, are the opposition parties accusing the government of making a mess that they won't pay for to solve?
Well, when it comes to all of the different industrial action that we've experienced over the last year or so, according to the polls, the strike action by nurses is the one that has the highest level of public support. So when it comes to costing and issues like that, I think the public are incredibly generous, because there is the true sense that nurses have made huge sacrifices, and the long-term structural issues that Chris mentioned in the NHS means that their workload and their conditions are much more difficult and seemingly getting worse. And therefore, when it comes to negotiating, I think the government really have to take the side of nurses if they don't think that this is enough, because oftentimes they often feel that actually people think that they just have to put up with this. So this may be a kind of rare opportunity. So I think nurses are right to ask for more money.
Well, I think that it is very, very important that we let the other unions who are still voting on these propositions come back, and then we'll see where we are at the time of this meeting on the 2nd of May. I do think the RCN result is disappointing. I do think when Pat Cullen herself is coming out and saying this is a fair deal, there is no question that I think union members do have to think about their responsibilities to their patients, and I think that will resonate with a lot of nurses. And we saw I was watching the BBC News over the weekend, and there was a nurse on there from, I think, West Yorkshire, saying how he wasn't going to leave his patients. And I think this is a very complex issue. We recognise fully the pressures that nurses face. We have 1.4 million staff in our NHS. The budget for it is £188 billion. There has to be realism about this.
But unfortunately, we have 116,000 vacancies. And we have a real problem in recruiting and retaining staff. We have people retiring early. This applies to GPs and all kinds of different...
We've addressed through our changes to income tax.
Well,
we'll come on to that.
We can come back to that.
But on that, Chris, just on that, would you like the Labour Party to put up a huge amount of money, a significant amount of money, any headroom that would be available, and put it into the National Health Service to relieve the sort of situation you're talking about?
My fundamental principle for a very long time has been that we've wanted in this country to have a Nordic, Scandinavian-style set of public services paying American-style taxes. And I just don't think that works in the end. No. So you do end up having to pay for the quality of public services you want. I would also say that you have to see everything in the round. So, for instance, if you have police officers who can't get operations, then they can't get back to work, then you're not just undermining the NHS by not funding it properly, you're also undermining all our other public services. And the private sector also relies, if we're going to get real growth into the economy, you have to have a strong set of public services that are properly funded.
Would you like to see taxes go up then? I mean, it's not something that Keir Starmer has talked about or the Labour front bench have talked about. No, it's not, but I'm genuinely asking. This is a discussion, you're right, that perhaps the country needs to have. I know Simon wants to see taxes cut, rightly or wrongly, but would you like to see them go up, or at least money be committed to the National Health Service to deal with recruitment?
Well, certainly, and one of the things I think we could do, I don't want to overplay this, but I think we could be getting rid of non-dom status because there's a significant amount of money that we could be ploughing into employing more doctors.
You have said that you will do that. But
yes, indeed. Well, but that's just one of the things. And of course, when we get closer to a general election, we'll need to lay out in much bigger detail what exactly we want to do for the NHS. But I just note, I had cancer 4 years ago. Nearly every part of the cancer pathway that I was involved in, and obviously most of that was in Wales, and I'm not making a partisan point here. We just need to be able to, we need to have confidence that in 10 years' time, our NHS in the UK will be world-beating as it was 20 years ago. And unfortunately, at the moment, very, very few people, or lots of people rather, are having to go private to pay for operations that they should be able to do on the NHS.
Yes, did that disturb you in any way or surprise you, the record number of people that are now looking at getting private health insurance because of their fears?
I think it's a reflection of how people ultimately want to make sure that they're doing the right thing for themselves and their families.
Are you joking?
Well, let him finish that, and then I'll come to you.
Of course, we want to make sure that the NHS backlogs are being addressed, and the strikes, which you are both of you not commenting on, the continuation of which. No, you haven't answered the question. Do you support them or not?
Although, Simon, the interesting thing about the strikes is they're also having an impact on the economy.
They are.
Those days lost are also causing
I quite
very
agree,
low
and that's
anaemic
why
growth.
we were disappointed by the results of the RCM ballot.
Or the government solving it.
We want the other unions to look at this very carefully.
So you want more people to go into private insurance?
Look, I think as a matter of personal choice, it is completely legitimate for people to take private medical insurance if they wish to. I think we should say that.
If they wish to, being a key point.
I quite agree.
The number of people I speak to now who are considering it are doing it because they cannot see their GPs, they cannot get the operations they need, they don't wish to do it, they feel they have to do it. And you know, there are others who there are other people
going back to work, I'm afraid, by refusing to say that.
Simon, I just want to make something crystal clear. He's trying to paint me and others as wanting these strikes. No one wants these strikes. Let's be absolutely clear about it.
Deeply evasive.
You know what's deeply offensive, Simon, is the people who have found out this week that they have cancer, who aren't going to meet the waiting times. And the reason why they aren't going to meet that waiting times is because of failure by your government. That is what I find deeply offensive.
Then would you commit to more money and more money going into pay, or would it lead to higher inflation?
In all seriousness, I do think that there is an important conversation we need to have as a country about how we manage the health service. There are two things that strike me as very wasteful. One is the number of locums and people that we have to pay a huge amount of money for who aren't part of the system, who end up having to come in. They are in and out. I speak to a number of nurses on wards who recognise that actually the wards aren't as efficient as they could be because they don't have that regular staff. And the other thing that we need to be really, really mindful of is that actually we have a big bubble coming up in our population, an older population. We've actually got life expectancy stalling under this government.
So you would look at a higher offer if you were sat round that table? 7%?
I think the government, any government, if they've rejected an offer, need to get nurses back to work, and they do that by talking to them. That's self-evident.
Potentially about higher offer. Let me just show you this headline in the Times, because we've been talking about, well, tax cuts or possibly putting more money into the NHS. Sunak plans tax cut and wage hike in run-up to election. I'll come to Simon in just a moment on that. Is that something you'd back, Inaya?
Well, I think when it comes to tax cuts, I think there is a worry that it is just tinkering around the edges. As we've just kind of talked about, we've had little to no growth in the economy for the best part of several decades. Wages have stagnated for a decade. Inflation is through the roof, and we have very little inward investment in this country. So there are deep structural problems in the way that our economy works, which is making it the cost of living increase. So kind of tinkering around the edges in order to shore up your election doesn't seem to me to be the kind of long-term thinking that we need in order to improve prosperity for people for generations.
It's tinkering, Simon.
If I can put the counter case, the tax burden in this country is the highest it's been for 70 years. We've obviously been through a series of shock events, be that the financial crisis, the pandemic and obviously war in Ukraine.
And Liz Truss's government.
No, and it is absolutely vital. And you know what? Liz Truss was absolutely right to say that it is anti-competitive for us to have these are very high taxes. We've just increased corporation tax from 19p to 25p. I wouldn't have done that. I absolutely believe that in the end we should be backing the wealth creators, the innovation, which you see, frankly, in more dynamic economies than the UK's, and that is the way you generate
sort of
jobs
cut in income tax
and more revenue for public
What
services.
sort of cut in income tax would you be supportive of? Would you advocate?
I recognise that the Chancellor's hands are constrained, but I certainly would like to see us return to what Rishi Sunak set out during his summer leadership campaign of reducing the basic rate of income tax.
But what difference would it make when tax thresholds have been frozen and they continue to be frozen, and it is that actually, Simon,
they're worth 4p
that is actually bearing down on
you know
people,
what?
and a cut in income tax.
And I would absolutely like to see us address fiscal drag as well. But you cannot then do that and be advocating, as Layla and Chris are, that we should be spending more money on our public services. The NHS budget is £188,000 million this year.
Yes.
That is a colossal sum of money, and people have to recognise we cannot simply spend our way to success.
So, Chris, I mean, Keir Starmer wants to see a cut in the basic rate of income tax too.
Does he? You're telling me something I didn't know. But my fundamental point about all our public services is that they all connect one to another. You can't have successful businesses unless the roads work and the trains work, and so the whole of the economy hangs together. The reason that for the last 14 years we've only had 6% growth is because I think we've made bad choices. Successive Conservative governments have made bad choices about our public services. Austerity didn't work as a political doctrine. It was fundamentally ill-conceived.
So what would you do now, then, on a tax basis?
So my answer to the NHS is that you have to have people working in the NHS who have confidence that in 10 years' time it's going to be a great place to live and work, and it's going to be doing the job.
Sure.
As it was, incidentally, when we left office in 2010.
Yeah, that's because that's because you increased taxes, of course, which was
and we contributed more.
Fine. So what I'm trying to get to is
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go on.
Every year we put up the amount of money that we were putting into the NHS, because the NHS costs more. Inflation in the NHS is higher than elsewhere, and if you don't have a healthy nation, you're not going to have a growing economy. I mean, it's a fundamental point. And so one of the no, it's not.
It is, Chris.
And so one other tiny point, which is just that I do not understand why the government this year has cut the number of training places for doctors. So we will rely on doctors and nurses from other countries again.
Yeah. On tax, what would you be advocating, Layla?
Well, let's see where we are at the next election. As I said before, every year that goes by under this government, we are seeing less and less confidence in this economy. We have no faith at all that Rishi Sunak's going to sort this out. And by the way, I say we. I've been speaking to voters over the last couple of weeks. This is the number one thing that people who used to vote Conservative are saying to me on doors for the reason they're not going to be in this local election, or indeed the general, because I asked them, is the economy. They are finding that they are working all hours to make ends meet. I met a lady whose husband runs a small business. She helps to do the books. They're raising 3 kids. They're looking at their bank balance at the end of the month, and they are not finding that this government is supporting them. And so all the things that we've been hearing in the news, cutting inheritance tax, whatever, the question that the government needs to answer is how is it going to help her? And so what the Liberal Democrats will always be relied upon to do in our costed manifestos, which then they always are, is focus on the lower and middle income family, what's going to help them the most. That is our thesis question.
And what is it? Oh, that's a thesis question, but you haven't got an answer yet.
Not yet, because we don't know how much money is going to be in the coffers by then. Lord knows what they're going to do between now and then.
But it is about priorities. All right, you've made that a priority. Will you spend more money? Will you cut taxes for those sorts of people?
We'll have to see what we can do at that point. But yeah, that's
they'll raise taxes. They'll raise taxes.
That's not true.
We
are the ones.
No, come on. It's absolutely
we are the
that you will raise taxes.
No, one thing
we spend money on anything.
Look,
pledge anything to anyone.
This coming from someone who was so cavalier with Liz Truss that they tanked the economy and then cost these very families in their mortgage payments. It's you that caused the problem, Simon. Please stop being sanctimonious about this. You caused the problem.
£54 billion worth of waste.
Basic competence counts for something, surely.
Democrats wouldn't know much about that.
On mortgage rates, let's take the issue of mortgage rates, because they are still feeding through.
Quite right.
And they have been increased. Liberal Democrats have said they've put £3 billion aside to help people with higher mortgage payments. Do you still regret that decision that led to those mortgage rates?
I absolutely do not regret the fundamental proposition that Liz Truss was setting out, which is that the tax burden in this country is too high and needs to come down. There is absolutely no question that mortgage rates the world over have risen.
Do you
sharply.
acknowledge that Liz Truss contributed to that?
I acknowledge of course there was a response to the mini budget, which we regret, and there were mistakes made in the financial regulation system as well, which I think, in terms of the wider stability of the
£45 billion.
All right. Well, we're not going to relitigate it. I was just asking that question of Simon.
And tax cuts can, in themselves, generate more revenue and success over time, which is the fundamental.
Well, let me ask Inaya. But just before we move on that, do you think Simon is right by lowering taxes, trying to improve or incentivise business and investment? It can work.
Oh, I think the way that Liz Truss handled everything, I think many people have gone over it. It wasn't the right thing. The underlying premise that people having more of their own money to be able to spend in the way that they choose, and that's stimulating the economy. I think that's still a very live and real debate that many people agree with. But it's just not clear at a time when, as we've spoken about, mortgage rates are going up, the cost of living is increasing exponentially, that the government has kind of learnt the right lessons because the problems are still here.
All right. And also, if you have to pay £12,000 for a hip operation, you haven't got more of your own money, have you?
Oh, exactly.
But if you look at mortgage rates in America, they very much have mirrored our own. We are absolutely confident that as the pressure on... basically, central banks have been responding to this inflation crisis. They put up interest rates to combat that. As the inflationary pressure comes down, so too will interest rates.
All right, let me just show you this advert. It's called an attack ad in the political jargon, political language, as Rishi Sunak put out by Labour. It says, do you think adults convicted of sexually assaulting children should go to prison? Rishi Sunak doesn't. Now, there's been something of a backlash, even amongst some Labour MPs. Chris, what about you? Do you think that morally it is right to use the word morally, because Barry Gardiner said it wasn't? Labour MP said yesterday he thought it was immoral to suggest that Rishi Sunak doesn't want adults convicted of sexually assaulting children to go to prison.
I think if he really wanted to make sure that every single one of them went to prison, the Tory government for the last 13 years would have made that happen. So I fully accept that it's not a nice ad. It's rough, it's tough, it's pretty nasty. I think it's necessary, however.
Do you?
Because the one thing I'm not prepared to let Rishi Sunak get away with is this idea that they've got suddenly some kind of clean slate, that the last 13 years don't matter. Because he's not been there all of those 13 years. Obviously, he's only been
MP
but,
for half of it.
Indeed, but nonetheless, it's been a Tory government all that time. A little help from the Liberal Democrats for a while, but it's been a Tory government. No, of course, I'm not blaming you for this, but my point is, accountability is a fundamental principle of British politics. There will be lots of people in the British media who don't want the Tories to be accountable for anything that they've got wrong at any single point, but we will make them accountable.
Accountability is a fundamental principle of British politics. Who was the Director of Public Prosecutions throughout the period in question? It was Sir Keir Starmer.
Not throughout.
I'm afraid that Keir Starmer and sentencing policy, going back to the start of the last decade, which you are referring to, Chris, was set by him. So look, there is no question that this was.
Do you contest the facts?
This was a deeply distasteful advert. Many. Of course, we want to see rape convictions go high, and they are increasing now on the latest statistics.
No,
Chris, rape convictions are now going up, and the number of people going to jail is rising in the latest statistics. We all want them to rise. It is a complex crime to...
You think rape statistics for convictions and prosecutions are rising?
Yes, they
by
are.
Tiny amounts.
They are rising.
From a very low and from an almost non-existent above.
You're lucky.
All right, let's return...
200...
Yes, Chris, let's Simon...
If 1 in 200 people who presently go to the police...
of course, that should go higher. And of course that should go high. And we are working.
But what's wrong with it? What is wrong with what is, yes, a cutthroat game, politics, isn't it?
It is a cutthroat game. And you know what? It is for political parties to make their decisions about what is or is not a tasteful advert, and indeed one which will resonate with voters.
So the Tories have never put out an advert like that ever, right? Yeah, sure. Look, we all know that all political parties use adverts like this to make their point.
Yes.
I think what made the one
I'll just show you this one. You're not averse to it either. New Prime
not.
Minister Liz Truss, previous Conservative Prime Minister, and there you can read all the headlines. Same old Conservatives.
So
very personal.
Absolutely right, because it was, and it is, for many people who can't afford to pay their bills. I think the one around children, sexual exploitation and that, the thing that made me uncomfortable about that is the number of tropes that link high-profile politicians with paedophilia and the conspiracy theories that go around all of that. And that's what made me uncomfortable about that one, because it felt like the Labour Party was maybe tapping into something that I'm not convinced we should be going. I think not deliberately, but do you see, that's what sat very uncomfortably with me. The other ones I've seen, by the way, on taxes and everything else, fair game. And, you know, if you guys can't hack it, it's a bit snowflake.
What was your reaction to that initial one?
Yeah, you know, I don't think Rishi Sunak can completely disassociate himself from the legacy of the Conservative Party. I don't think it's fair to say, well, he's only been Prime Minister for a few months. You know, we have had 13 or so years of Conservative rule. But I think for most people, it was this sense that child sexual abuse was being kind of exploited for political...
And by the way, this is another one, just so that people realise this was on the tax loophole. But yes.
But on that particular one that started it, you know, exploited for political gain. And, that, you know, Labour trying to now talk tough on crime and these kinds of issues at the same time, and we have been having a discussion over the last couple of weeks with Suella Braverman talking about the fact that certain crimes weren't investigated properly for perceived cultural sensitivities and so on. So it does seem that oftentimes when it comes to actually acting tough and dealing with criminals, we are not as strong as we could be. But when it comes to where it serves a political end, then all of a sudden people want to act tough on it.
Do you think it works?
Sorry, Joe. I want us to be wise rather than tough. I think all this macho language about crime and order and all that, and law and order, is a nonsense. I much prefer us to be wise about it, because best policing is done on the basis of intelligence. And one of the things that I think...
But sentencing is also about being harsh and punishing people for crimes they've committed.
Sometimes, but also it's also about trying to prevent recidivism, because otherwise you perpetuate a problem. And one of the things I've worked on a long time is brain injury. Lots of people in prison have people who've had brain injuries. But the point I was going to make was that one of the stupid things we did in 2010 was cut 20,000 police officers. I know we're employing another 20,000 now, but the thing is we've got inexperienced police officers now because all the experienced ones left. And I think that that's one of the problems that we have. One of the reasons that next to no burglaries are now investigated or ever brought to any kind of trial. And I would argue the same for the rape and domestic violence figures, which are
appalling,
shocking in the UK. And I do want to prosecute that argument against Rishi Sunak. I'd love it if I could always do that nicely. But I'm not. So
you're not.
Nice,
but you're not comfortable. But you're not comfortable.
Well, no, I know I am. As I said on a radio programme last week, I think it may be distasteful, but I think it's necessary.
Simon?
Well, it's for viewers to judge, and ultimately they'll make up their own minds. As I say, the idea that Keir Starmer is not at the heart of sentencing policy decisions over that period is laughable. And the reality is that we had to make the very difficult decisions we did in 2010 because the last Labour government left the country bankrupt. And that is, I'm afraid to say, a reality.
So I think we can see there that there will be some attack ads against the Labour.
And none of you is innocent.
And in 2010, you actually said that there was a Tory party one attacking Gordon Brown personally, which said that he'd let, I can't remember the number, 48,000 people out of prison.
Right. Yeah. I mean, does it work, though? I mean, is there any evidence to show that it will get voted?
It does.
Right.
It's really sad.
I think it does.
I think the reality is that an ad like this will have as much of a detrimental impact with some voters as it will engage others. And the truth is that the truth is that all of these adverts, when they become as overtly personalised and contentious as this one was, run risks.
And we don't want the Americanisation of our... I mean, this is a very American issue as well, where they personally attack people, and it gets.
But isn't it a bit
nasty.
late for that?
I think, do we want to get back to a politics where we're all debating on the fact and we don't get personal?
Has it ever been that way?
I would love that. But I would say it's a bit rich for Tory MPs, given their track record on putting out adverts like that, sometimes incredibly personally, against other MPs over the course of the last 10 years, to now cry foul. I'm sorry, if you're going to want to de-escalate the language, start with your own and start with your cabinet members at the dispatch box in the House. That would be a great start if you want to bring back politics to a level of civilised political debate.
I'm just going to interject because we've just had some breaking news. Let me just show you this tweet from my colleague Nick Eardley. The Prime Minister is being investigated by Standards Commissioner over a declaration of interest. It is an update, actually, to the Commissioner's website, which says that Rishi Sunak's being probed of a declaration of interest. Number 10 said, "We are happy to assist the Commissioner to clarify how this has been transparently declared as a ministerial interest." Now, the BBC understands the investigation is in relation to Koru Kids, a childcare firm his wife has shares in. Last month, the Chancellor announced a pilot of payments for new childminders, with more for those who sign through agencies. There'll be more of that, of course, on the BBC BBC website. But just to reiterate, the Prime Minister is being investigated by the Standards Commissioner over a declaration of interest. Just to finish this off before we move on. In the end, Simon, do you think that this is going to be the sort of star we are going to see, just as Chris has said, between now and the next election?
I suspect we will see some pretty tough
from both
adverts.
the Conservative.
I mean, ultimately, we are approaching a general election year, and it's, you know, it is, as I say, I'm perfectly happy for political parties to put out what they would like and then be held accountable for it. That is, in the end, a matter of judgment and taste for them. Is
there a problem, just briefly, that Keir Starmer opens himself up to the sort of criticism you just heard from Simon when he was Director of Public Prosecutions? It could backfire.
Well, Boris Johnson started with that last year, didn't he?
Well,
I don't remember Simon attacking him then. But look, I mean, politics can be a rough business. What Labour has to do, I think Keir has been absolutely right. First of all, we had to regain the Labour Party and detoxify the brand. Secondly, we had to prosecute the case against the government for their failures over the last 13, 14 years. And thirdly, we have to offer something positive to the British people. That is basically what a general election is going to be about.
On that, let's talk about something completely different. The Times has this headline: Brecon beacons to be renamed in response to climate change. The National Park says changing its name will make it eco-friendly and even more Welsh. Well, this is next door to your constituency, isn't it?
It is.
Chris? And you can tell us the new name and whether you think it's going to work in terms of pursuing eco-friendly policies.
Well, first of all, it's not the new name. It's
an old name.
It's always been there.
Yes.
It's just that they've taken the kind of English language one off. And incidentally, there's no law that forbids you from keeping on saying Brecon Beacons.
Well,
and I think a lot of my constituents, if they're going up Pen y Fan next weekend, will probably still think that they're going to the Brecon Beacons. But I think it's nice when we regain some of our Welsh heritage. We're very proud. I don't speak Welsh, the language myself. Most of my constituents don't. But there is a beauty to Welshes. And Matt Michael Sheen should, of course, be a national treasure.
All right, well, let's have a listen to him.
A new kind of national park. Not the Brecon Beacons National Park, though. Not anymore. No, this place has a new name now, or rather, an old one. Brecon, an old name for a new way to be. A name from our past to take us into our future.
All very stirring stuff. Inaya, does it stir you in terms of saying that it's going to be part of a wider plan to address emergencies around climate change and biodiversity, and the beacon, the logo of a giant burning brazier, was not a good look?
Well, you know, I mean, I would struggle to pronounce that name. I think a lot of people would.
Brecon, I've been practicing.
You just have to get the...
Yeah, I'll practice. But I think, you know, I think it's a good marketing technique to draw attention to it. And I think it's a beautiful language, and it is always good to connect to older languages and indigenous languages. But at the same time, you know, is it part of this kind of idea that we need to go to this pre-industrial age where, you know, before technology, and we were all kind of living in the hills, and it sounds a bit like that to me.
Oh, well, there's an invitation you can't refuse, Leila.
I think it's lovely. Jane Dodds, our leader in Wales, has warmly welcomed it. She was the MP for Brecon before. It's lovely.
And
what's more there to say?
Well,
I mean,
most people, I think, will just say Banai. They won't say the whole lot.
I still haven't got an answer to my question about the climate change. Well, actually, Anaya did.
I'm not sure there's a tremendously substantive link. I mean, I obviously, you know, warmly believe in the battle against climate change. I'm not sure that this is the most significant element of our national and indeed international work to deliver on net zero by 2050. I would also say, actually, as someone who's got, you know, family in Wales, that I am slightly cautious about the way in which the Welsh language can actually be praised to the exclusion of the English-speaking population of Wales. And it does feel as though there is an element now whereby actually this is now pushing back against a more inclusive United Kingdom. I ultimately believe passionately in one United Kingdom, and I do have slight concerns about the renaming of these places in this way.
What do you say in response to that?
Oh no, I was going to respond to the previous bit, which is about climate change. So actually, the peat bogs on the top of a lot of the Brecon Beacons or on the Banai are really important because the moss is part of what actually absorbs carbon, and so we've been trying to rewild quite a lot of the areas above the Rhondda recently.
Right.
It is a part of us doing our bit for net zero.
Well, you've taken us pretty well to the end of the programme. Thank you to all of my guests. I'll be back tomorrow. Bye-bye.